All right, we're going to pick back up in our new book reading. It is Crimes and Cover-Up in American Politics, 1776 to 1963. The History They Didn't Teach You in School by Donald Jefferies. Foreword was by Ron Paul. We are still in Chapter 1, and this is Part 3. So here we go. The Founding Fathers left a great deal behind on the public record, in their comments and in their writings. It takes very little research to comprehend how utterly opposed they would be to virtually anything our leaders have done from the past century or more. It is only because of the massive ignorance most Americans have about their history which permits the disinformation of the establishment, historians, and mainstream media to go unchecked. Thomas Jefferson succinctly expressed the way most of the founders felt about placing too much power in the hands of any individual or group of individuals when he said, "In question of power, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution." Patrick Henry famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." Joseph Warren echoed this with, "We determine to die or be free." The significance of the American War for Independence cannot be exaggerated. As James Madison immodestly but accurately stated, it was indeed a revolution which has no parallel in the annals of human society. Anyone who looks at present-day America and believes that this is what was intended and fought for is more clueless than I can describe. Despite the assurances of the professional historians, a 2013 Gallup poll found that 71% of those polled thought that the Founding Fathers would be ashamed of modern America. We have often been told that the Second Amendment of the Constitution was meant to apply only to state-regulated militias. George Mason, one of the most extreme Founding Fathers, had a principal driving force behind the Bill of Rights, delineated the debate in a speech before the Virginia Ratifying Commission on June 14, 1778, in which he exclaimed, "I ask, sir, what is the militia? It is the whole people. To disarm the people is the best and most effectual way to enslave them." Richard Henry Lee, in the September 8, 1788 Charleston State Gazette, boldly spoke of the right of freeholders, citizens, and husbandmen who take up arms to preserve their property as individuals and their rights as free men. In 1788, Samuel Adams told the Massachusetts Commission that nothing should prevent the people of the United States, who are peaceable citizens, from keeping their own arms. Thomas Jefferson described our present-day situation perfectly when he noted, "Laws that forbid the carrying of arms disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. An unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man." Patrick Henry, during the debates over adoption of the Constitution, argued with his typical eloquence that, "Are we at last brought to such humiliating and debasing degradation that we cannot be trusted with the arms for our defense? Where is the difference between having our arms in possession and under our direction and having them under the management of Congress? If our defense be the real object of having those arms, in whose hands can they be trusted with more propriety or equal safety to us as in our hands?" Even Alexander Hamilton, who predictably lobbied in the Federalist Papers for mandatory military service, acknowledged the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. The founders would have been aghast at what Dwight Eisenhower christened the military-industrial complex. They were fiercely against the concept of a standing army, as Elbridge Jerry explained during the constitutional debates. What, sir, is the use of a militia? It is to prevent the establishment of a standing army, the ban of liberty. Whenever governments mean to invade the rights and liberties of the people, they always attempt to destroy the militia in order to raise an army upon their ruins. Noah Webster, father of the modern dictionary, recognized this as well, warning, another source of power in government is a military force. But this, to be efficient, must be superior to any force that exists among the people or which they can command, for otherwise this force would be annihilated on the first exercise of acts of oppression. Before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in most every kingdom in Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops that can be, on any pretense, raised in the United States. Roger Sherman, during the debates over the 1790 Militia Act, reminded us that it was the privilege of every citizen and one of his most essential rights to bear arms and to resist every attack upon his liberty or property by whomsoever made. George Washington said firearms stand next in importance to the Constitution itself. There is no doubt about what the founders meant by the people's right to bear arms. And the Second Amendment and those who irrationally insist upon a different interpretation are obviously motivated by a political agenda. In one of his rare lucid moments, California Governor Jerry Brown once said that he was in favor of the people having the right to bear arms because the police and the military have them. Needless to say, those who wrote the First Amendment would be flabbergasted at all the modern assaults upon it. They would have been repelled by free speech zones. In her book, The Silencing, How the Left is Killing Free Speech, Kirsten Powers demonstrated, among other things, that campuses across the United States had become ground zero for silencing free speech. Recently, a majority of students at Yale University signed a satirical petition to repeal the First Amendment, some of them with great enthusiasm. Jefferson, Madison, George Mason, Patrick Henry, and company would not have understood hate speech. In May 2015, CNN reporter Chris Cumio declared that hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. Cumio tweeted with astonishing ignorance, especially considering he's an attorney, "Don't you just love the Constitution? Read it." There are, of course, no references whatsoever to hate in the Constitution, and none of the founders would have supported the notion that civil liberties should be restricted based upon some subjective interpretation of it. George Washington's farewell address would have the same effect upon our modern lawmakers as a crucifix does to a vampire. Could American foreign policy of the last 100 years possibly be less consonant with Washington's advice of harmony, liberal intercourse with all nations, are recommended by policy, humanity, and interest? But even our commercial policy should hold an equal and impartial hand, neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors or preferences. His admonition that America adopt peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, represents the antithesis of modern-day American foreign policy. If he were alive today, how could the father of our country be anything other than dumbfounded by our perpetual bombings, invasions, embargoes, and occupations of other sovereign nations? But this is merely the continuation of a disturbing trend that violates not only Washington's philosophy, but also the spirit of the revolution itself. By many estimates, the United States has been at war for 93% of the time since it declared its independence from Great Britain. Incredibly, America has never enjoyed even a single day of uninterrupted peace. James Madison, although forced into an unavoidable conflict with Great Britain in 1812, reflected the general perspective of the Founding Fathers with the following statement. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises, not compromises. It comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceeded debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. The same malignant aspect in republicanism, the advocacy of a republic as a means of a government, may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of a state of war and in the degeneracy of manners and of morals engendered by both. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. The separation of powers, delineating equal roles for the three branches of the federal government, had become so lopsided in favor of the executive and judiciary that the founders would be reloading their muskets if they were around. As James Madison reminded posterity, none of them ought to possess, directly or indirectly, an overruling influence over the others. The consolidation of power that we see today in the executive and judicial branches represents what Madison called the very definition of tyranny. More specifically, when Madison wrote, the opinion which gives to the judges the right to decide what laws are constitutional and what are not only for themselves in the sphere of action, but for the legislature and executive also in their sphere, would make the judiciary a despotic branch. He was basically describing what has taken place in America for at least a century. Thomas Jefferson early on argued with the Federalists about the role of the judiciary, declaring in a September 1820 letter, "You seem to consider the judges the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions, a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. Our judges and their power are the more dangerous as they are in office for life and are not responsible as the other functionaries are to the elective control. There is nothing in the Constitution that permits the Supreme Court to strike down a law, but John Marshall simply asserted the right of judicial review in 1803, and the rest is history." And Jefferson would be shocked and saddened to learn that nearly everyone with any power now firmly holds that the courts are indeed the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions. Judicial tyranny has gone far beyond anything envisioned even by Alexander Hamilton and the other early supporters of a strong judiciary. Although the founders were quite clear about what their intentions were, beginning especially with the administration of Abraham Lincoln, the establishment of this unprecedented form of government would gradually come to be viewed as the experiment in democracy by all the best and brightest scholars. Benjamin Franklin compared a democracy with a constitutional republic thusly: "Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote." Unfortunately, the perspective of our leaders would evolve from Jefferson's ringing, "When governments fear the people, there is liberty. When people fear the government, there is tyranny," to Abraham Lincoln's plutocratic, "Let reverence for the laws become the political religion of the nation, and let everyone sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars." Woodrow Wilson would ultimately declare that the American Revolution was a beginning, not a consummation. Larry Sabato, a quintessential court historian who wrote a particularly awful book recently on the JFK assassination, expressed the prevailing view of our corrupt oligarchy when he said, "The failure of the nation to update the Constitution and the structure of government it originally bequeathed to us is at the root of our current political dysfunction." Yes, if only we'd just get rid of that pesky Bill of Rights thing and all the limitations placed upon state control of the people. One of Sabato's numerous suggestions on ways to improve the Constitution is to require all able-bodied young Americans to perform 2 years of national service. Historians, politicians, and the mainstream media simply cannot focus much on the heart of the revolutionary drama, which involved American citizen activists throwing off the yoke of British oppression. Considering how handsomely they profited under the present system, It really isn't in their interest to do so. When they pay attention to the subject at all, they avoid the essential matter of motivation, of why the colonists were compelled to such drastic actions. More importantly, they ignore how blatantly similar our situation is today to 1776, and how the usurpations of power on the part of today's government have widely exceeded the tyranny experienced under King George III. If they spoke favorably of this revolutionary spirit, they couldn't in the next breath produce piece after piece of draconian legislation designed explicitly to prevent this generation and future generations of Americans from ever rebelling against them. Would we really expect leaders who throw brave whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning into prison and desperately want to do the same thing to traitor Edward Snowden to side with the Sons of Liberty, which George Mason and Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson? This is really the only plausible explanation, for instance, of why the Revolutionary era and its most prominent figures have been so scrupulously ignored by Hollywood. While the so-called Tea Party movement was clearly co-opted early on, the very name itself invokes the wrath of the establishment for the most obvious of reasons. The unpleasant reality is that virtually everyone with a public voice in today's world would stand solidly in opposition to the Founding Fathers. In recent years, the World War II generation, thanks to the promotional efforts of former NBC News anchor Tom Brokaw and others, has come to be hailed as the greatest generation. I think this is about as preposterous a claim as most mainstream media's claims are. If any generation deserves such a distinction, it would be the generation that fought for and attained American independence. With all their human faults, the Founding Fathers took the concepts of enlightened thinkers like John Locke and Edmund Burke and the cherished tradition of the Magna Carta and developed as perfect a form of government as can be developed. The separation of powers, the balance between the three equal branches, the limitations placed upon the government, and the protections granted to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of the press were landmarks of intellectual and philosophical brilliance, if only subsequent generations had followed their lead. Chapter 2. Pre-1860, Jacksonian Democracy. The highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. John Quincy Adams. Meriwether Lewis. I am not a coward, but I am so strong, so hard to die. Meriwether Lewis. American school children still learn about the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 and the expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. In recent years, even the mainstream media has begun delving into the mysterious death of Lewis, who supposedly committed suicide on October 11, 1809. An episode of the History Channel's America Unearthed revealed that the bloodstains on Lewis's Masonic apron were not his and actually belonged to two other persons. Even the normally staunch anti-conspiracy writer Brad Meltzer seems to have jumped on the Lewis was murdered bandwagon. As Xavier Hayes, co-author of the book The Suppressed History of America, The Murder of Meriwether Lewis and the Mysterious Discoveries of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, wrote on his blog, both Lewis and Clark were Masons. In fact, Lewis was a master Mason known for achieving high rank among American Masons in almost record time. Hayes also makes the extraordinary claim that George Washington had been indebted to the Rothschilds, who were instrumental in helping him attain his position as land surveyor. Much of the official story of Meriwether Lewis's death hinges on the testimony of James Neely, who accompanied Lewis on the trip but wasn't at the scene of his death. According to Catherine Moore of the History News Network, family tradition among Clark's descendants, however, holds that he later voiced doubts that his friend would have committed such a desperate act. One of those deeply involved in assembling the journals of Lewis and Clark or getting them published was Nicholas Biddle, a powerful financier who served as the second and last president of the Second Bank of the United States. Because of the inadequate investigation into the death of this herald man, who was Thomas Jefferson's private secretary and considered a young political figure on the rise, conspiracy theories have emerged over the years. The official suicide theory also rests on the curious notion that Lewis himself. No. The official suicide theory also rests on the curious notion that Lewis shot himself more than once. In 1994, a book called The Jefferson Conspiracies: A President's Role in the Assassination of Meriwether Lewis was published. The author, journalist David Leon Chandler, who had worked on the JFK assassination stories for Life magazine and even got a mention in the Warren Report, had the dramatic sense of timing to die just prior to its publication. While mainstream historians are perfectly content to destroy Thomas Jefferson's reputation, the critical response to Chandler's book was decidedly lukewarm. Chandler's theory held the notorious General James Wilkinson, whom Jefferson had removed as governor of Louisiana in favor of Lewis, had sent agents to assassinate his rival. The aforementioned witness, James Neely, was a close associate of Wilkinson's. Another Wilkinson ally, Captain Gilbert Russell, wrote letters to Jefferson that became the foundation for the official suicide narrative. According to Arthur Hayes, these letters were proven to be forgeries by handwriting experts in 1996. Chandler went a step further, however, and suggested that Jefferson participated in a cover-up of his young protege's death, for fear of his own connection to some of Wilkinson's dubious activities being exposed. Publishers Weekly was quick to prove the establishment spin, stating Chandler's reconstruction rests heavily on poorly documented inferences. Much as the descendants of John Wilkes Booth had been unable to get the body buried in Baltimore's Greenmount Cemetery exhumed, Meriwether Lewis's family heirs have been trying unsuccessfully for a decade to get his body exhumed. As of September 25, 2010, story in the Wall Street Journal exclaims, a recent letter from the U.S. Department of the Interior turning down the exhumation request as just the latest in a string of rejections handed down to the Lewis family, all distant relatives of Mr. Lewis's sister Jane, because the explorer didn't marry or have children. Actually, the Department of Interior had initially approved the exhumation, but as of June 27, 2010, article in Think Progress reported the National Park Service has reversed a previous decision allowing Meriwether Lewis's body to be exhumed in an attempt of determining how he died. The decision, backed by Department of the Interior officials, cites policy prohibiting disturbing graves that are not threatened by destruction. We are terribly disappointed, said Howell Lewis Bowen, an Albemarle County resident and direct descendant. We've worked with the Park Service through 3 administrations, Clinton and Bush and now Obama, and we thought we were finally getting somewhere. We only seem to encounter this kind of firm mindset not to honor an exhumation request when the body in question is a historical figure that may disprove a typically inaccurate piece of establishment history. For instance, a spokesman with West London's Brompton Cemetery declared, if a family wants to exhume the remains of a relative, then obviously we try to help as much as possible. In America, news reports indicate that moving bodies from one cemetery to another is becoming much more commonplace. While most states require special permits and licenses to do so, it generally doesn't seem to be difficult. The main issue routinely seems to be the cost involved. I had a telephone conversation with Howell Bowen on November 5, 2015. Bowen was obviously still frustrated by his long efforts to establish the truth about his illustrious ancestor's death, but also seemed a bit weary of the subject. He reminded me that the grave had been opened once before in 1847, and that their conclusion was then was that it looked like he died at the hands of an assassin. Bowen shared his personal suspicion that the body interred in Lewis's grave may not actually be that of Meriwether Lewis. Bowen provided the following statement to me. It has been a very frustrating 19 years since 1996, when a Tennessee jury recommended I can't say that word, humiliation to determine cause of death of my fourth great uncle, Meriwether Lewis. His unfortunate death has long been a topic of discussion among his family. While there is much speculation and many theories, we only want to know the truth, whatever it is. We would also like to give his remains a Christian burial, which he never received. Excellent attorneys gave their time and expertise to get permission for an exhumation. There was to be no cost to the United States government. The Interior Department, and in particular the National Park Service, under Interior Department jurisdiction, set up roadblocks all along the way. Even after receiving permission and working to fulfill all requirements with no cooperation from Park Service as promised, the decision was abruptly reversed with change in national administration. It appears the Park Service and certain historians are afraid the truth may change history books and their reputations. Perhaps it would not, but I do not believe we will ever know. I do not believe the family's wishes will ever be fulfilled. The mystery will continue. I believe Meriwether Lewis would greatly appreciate the enormous work done by many on his behalf to verify correct history and would be greatly disappointed in his beloved country's non-cooperation. For now, from what I've been able to determine, the family seems to be the final arbiter in determining if a body can be exhumed, unless the body can solve a historical mystery, that is. The War of 1812. War should only be declared by the authority of the people, whose toils and treasures are to support its burdens, instead of the government which is to reap its fruits. James Madison. When Americans think of the War of 1812, they usually picture Washington, D.C. being burnt down, including the White House, and First Lady Dolley Madison heroically rescuing the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. That is, if they think of it at all. An increasing number of people would probably know nothing more than that it began in 1812. Some conspiracy theorists believe that the War of 1812 was ordered by Nathan Rothschild in retaliation for the First National Bank's charter not being renewed in 1811. The First National Bank had been dominated by foreign investors, first and foremost of these being the Rothschilds. This is acknowledged by even mainstream historians, even though they instinctively reject the hypothesis that Alexander Hamilton was an agent for the Rothschilds, or that he actually married into the Rothschild family. In January 8, 2013 story in Business Insider, the following quote is attributed to Nathan Rothschild, although the article notes it hasn't been verified. Either the application for the renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. Court historians attribute the causes of the War of 1812 to the same conglomeration of non-conspiratorial reasons that are trotted out to explain every war. Alternative views hold that the war was fought for the typical reason of further enriching the bankers. If Rothschild's goal was to increase America's debt, he was certainly successful, as the country's debt surged during 1812 through 1815. As a result, President James Madison authorized the creation of the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. Foreign shares Steve Rothschild of France, rumored to be a principal investor. It was no conspiracy theorist, but Business Insider that acknowledged the Rothschilds would go on to perfect the strategy of lending to countries on each side of a conflict over the following century of chronic warfare. Ironically, considering how secession would be viewed some 50 years later, a serious secession movement in New England began in response to Thomas Jefferson's embargo against Great Britain, their primary trading partner. In this case, it was the Federalists, gradually to become the Republicans under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, who were unhappy with federal policy and aspired to a separatist movement. During the Civil War, of course, it would be these same Federalist Republicans that would vehemently deny that the Southern states had any such right. As we can see so clearly today, our political world has always been full of this kind of partisan hypocrisy. One of the most astounding historical coincidences involved the passing of founding fathers John Adams and Thomas Jefferson at around the same time. Many Americans felt that the date of their deaths were in fact divinely inspired. They had become intense political rivals, with Jefferson's vehement opposition to Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts being the primary impetus for the mud-slinging 1800 presidential election between them. The old friends, however, graduated to a friendly truce and left behind a treasure trove of correspondence to each other. Both men died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In a letter written shortly before his death to Roger C. Waitman, Jefferson had declared, "May our Declaration of Independence be to the world what I believe it will be to some part sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves and to assume the blessings and security of self-government." In a lesser-known correlating death, former President James Monroe died 5 years later, also on July 4th. Freemasons and Anti-Masons. Freemasonry is deceptive and fraudulent. Its promise is light. Its performance is darkness. John Quincy Adams. When Captain William Morgan of New York mysteriously disappeared in 1826 after announcing his intention to write a book exposing the secrets of Freemasonry, the incident sparked public outcry and led directly to great distrust and suspicion about the secretive organization. Powerful publisher and Whig Party figure Thurlow Weed was inspired to found the new anti-Masonic Party in response, which ran a presidential candidate in 1832 against Mason Democrat Andrew Jackson. Morgan, who had been a member of the Masons in Canada, was arrested on September 11, 1826 on bogus charges for non-payment of a loan and stealing a shirt and tie. A badly decomposed body washed ashore on Lake Ontario in October 1827, but was identified as another missing person. Some Freemasons claimed that Morgan had been paid to leave the country, and eventually 3 Masons were convicted of kidnapping him, but their light sentences outraged the public. There were allegations that powerful Masons had covered up the crime. Morgan's book, Illustrations of Masonry, was published posthumously and became a bestseller. In 1881, a grave was discovered on a New York Indian reservation that bore indications it could be Morgan's, but this was never proven. A year later, the National Christian Association, a group opposed to all secret societies, erected a memorial to Morgan in New York's Batavia Cemetery. John Quincy Adams, 6th President of the United States, became the most prominent figure among the anti-Masons. The only president to serve in Congress after his term of office, he was elected to the House of Representatives on the anti-Mason ticket in 1830. Adams was among the most brilliant of all U.S. presidents. He could speak and write 7 languages and had memorized Shakespeare and the classics by the time he was 10 years old. Adams' opposition to Masonry appears to have been fueled by his devout Christianity. He attended church so dutifully that he often worshiped twice on Sunday and was said to start each day by reading several Bible chapters. Adams' keen interest in the subject led to his letters on the Masonic Institution, which was originally published in 1847. Adams objected to the oaths administered to members, declaring, why don't that even sound right to me? The entered apprentice's oath was sufficient to settle in my mind the immoral character of the institution, was in itself vicious, and such as ought never to be administered by man to man. Adams, understandably concerned with how these vows could conflict with the laws, further stated, the entered apprentice promises never to reveal to any person under the canopy of heaven that which the laws of his country may make it his duty to reveal to any court of justice before which he may be summoned to appear. The Master Mason promises to keep the secrets of a brother Master Mason, murder and treason excepted. The naming of them emphatically murder and treason leaves all other crimes included in the promise and excluded from the exception. I do conscientiously and sincerely believe the order of Freemasonry, if not the greatest, is one of the greatest moral and political evils under which the Union is now laboring. A conspiracy of the few against the equal rights of the many. Masonry ought forever to be abolished. It is wrong, essentially wrong, a seed of evil which can never produce any good. Another president, Millard Fillmore, would say, the Masonic fraternity tramples upon our rights, defeats the administration of justice, and bids defiance to every government which it cannot control. As a strong man of faith, John Quincy Adams worried that if the candidate has been educated to a sincere and heartfelt reverence for religion and the Bible, and if he exercises his reason, he knows that all the tales of Jason and Boaz, of Solomon's temple, of Hiram Abeth and Jubilah and Jubilo and Jubileum are impostures, poisons poured into the perennial fountain of truth, traditions exactly resembling those reprobated by Jesus Christ, as making the Word of God of none effect, perfectly expressing the concerns many have with the excessive secrecy of the organization. Adams wrote that a Mason is sworn to keep secret what he does not know. The ominous threats delivered to the apprentice Mason of having my throat cut across from ear to ear, my tongue torn out by its roots, and my body buried in the rough sand of the sea at low water mark. And to the Master Mason of having his body severed in two in the midst and divided to the north and south, his bowels burnt to ashes in the center, and the ashes scattered before the four winds of heaven, as penalties for revealing Masonic secrets, appalled Adams and ought to stun any rational person. They are frightening, even in a symbolic sense. Adams even mentioned that this violates the passage in the Constitution against the infliction of cruel and unusual punishments for what he termed the breach of an absurd and senseless secret. Like almost all the Americans' early leaders, John Quincy Adams would be smeared as a hopeless isolationist if he attempted to enter the world of politics today. Reflecting the reality of his time, Adams reminded the world that America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. He should live in 2026, huh? Less than a century later, that kind of sentiment would become what's that? Anachronism. Anachronism, and be virtually unheard of within the quarters of power. That's the truth, because look what's going on today. We think we are just police of the world. Andrew Jackson. I have always been afraid of banks. Andrew Jackson wasn't perfect. He had a taste for violence and war that was far too strong for my liking, as indicated by his quote, "No one need think that the world can be ruled without blood." His treatment of the American Indians were disgraceful, especially the forcible removal of tribes from their lands, where thousands of them died during the drive west that came to be known as the Trail of Tears. But he was a tremendous foe of the bankers and the most populist president this country has ever seen, outside of perhaps Thomas Jefferson. Jackson, popularly known as Old Hickory, invited a swarm of less than genteel supporters into the White House following his 1828 inauguration. Legendary anecdotes persist about the rowdy, uncouth crowd and how they muddied the carpets and smashed crockery and glassware. Eventually, the punch bowls had to be moved outside onto the White House lawn. Jackson was roundly criticized for harboring a reign of king mob. Arthur J. Transbury, a contemporary of Jackson's, described the scene. No one who was at Washington at the time of General Jackson's inauguration is likely to forget that period to the day of his death. To us who had witnessed the quiet and orderly period of Adams' administration, it seemed as if Half the nation had rushed at once into the capital. It was like the inundation of the northern barbarians into Rome. It was the first and only time that the common American riffraff would be granted such free, unfettered access to the halls of power. Andrew Jackson disliked banks for personal land speculation and worthless banknotes during the time of the First National Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States had been rechartered in 1816, and its credit policies led to mortgage foreclosures, widespread unemployment, and falling prices that negatively impacted agriculture and manufacturing, which eventually resulted in what was called the Panic of 1819. In a bold move, Jackson vetoed the proposal to reauthorize the charter of the Bank of the United States, with the belief that some of the powers and privileges possessed by the existing banks are unauthorized by the Constitution, subversive of the rights of the states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. Every monopoly and all exclusive privileges are granted at the expense of the people, which ought to receive a fair equivalent. The many millions which this act proposes to bestow on the stockholders of the existing bank must come directly or indirectly out of the earnings of the American people. And I'm going to stop that there for now. Until next time, brothers and sisters, keep your eyes on Jesus and your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. I'm so sorry. I was looking at these, what are they called? Chats down below. Hello, hello, hello. Violet, Kaova, Clark, and I think that's it as far as I know. But hello, hello, hello. Have a blessed day. Bye-bye.